Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our Elohim, Yahweh is one, and you shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your might. And these words which I am commanding you today shall be in your heart, and you shall impress them upon your children, and you shall speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates.
Hallelujah. All right. Shabbat shalom, everyone, and greetings to the people in the outreach ministry. You know, from time to time, people will ask, why don't you do a teaching on what we should or should not do on the Sabbath day of rest? You ever thought about that? You ever thought about wanting a message about that? In the past, people have asked that. As human beings, we would all like to have a set of rules, all laid out nice and neatly, and this is exactly why there is an oral law. It's why there is a Talmud, a Mishnah, and this is exactly what Yahshua and Shaul were battling in so much of the New Testament. I believe that we don't know what we can and can't do on the Sabbath day because generally we really don't understand or comprehend what the Sabbath day is completely. I believe that this is so because of what we do and talk about on the Sabbath. And just that statement will make a lot of us squirm because we feel a certain discomfort about our Sabbath keeping. Am I right? Or am I alone feeling this way? Well, let's refresh some of the things about the Sabbath and see if a better understanding of this day helps us see the direction that we should be going. Hebrews chapter 3. New Testament. We're going to start out in the New Testament. Hebrews chapter 3, beginning in verse 7. Therefore, as the set-apart Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me, proved me, and saw my works 40 years. Therefore, I was grieved with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Verse 11, as I swore in my wrath, if they should enter into my rest, ... I think that's really supposed to be like a question. Should they enter into my rest? And we're going to see, this is repeated. This is a statement from the Old Testament, but there's also a statement from the book of Psalms. And we're going to see this statement repeated again. Should my people enter into my rest? Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11 have that statement. Verse 12, Hebrews 3:12. Look out, brothers. And in Hebrew, this word is akim, which means brothers and sisters. I think maybe the King James translates it as brethren, which is, in our understanding, close to what the Hebrew word akim means, because it includes women, brothers and sisters. Lest there be in any of you a wicked heart of unbelief. And we know that that word unbelief there is talking about obedience. In falling away from the living Elohim. Here's one thing that it is certainly permissible to do on the Sabbath. Encourage one another. Encourage one another. It says daily, while it is called today. And that today is capitalized because it is really speaking about the Sabbath. Lest any of you be hardened by the deceitfulness or deceivableness of sin. For we have become partakers of Messiah if we hold fast the beginning of our trust firm to the end. And of course, Yahshua said, he that endures to the end, that one is going to be saved. For who, having heard, rebelled? Who having heard rebelled? Was it not all those who came out of Egypt, out of Mitzrayim, led by Moshe, and with whom he was grieved 40 years? Aren't those the ones who, having heard, rebelled? And we're going to see some of the statements that Moses gave them from Yahweh about the Sabbath day. Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness for those 40 years? All of those that came out of adults that came out of Mitzrayim And the reason they wandered 40 years was because Yahweh said, you're not going to enter into my rest. You're not going to enter into my rest. So we see then they were unable to enter in because of unbelief. Well, it wasn't what was in their heart. It wasn't what was in their mind. It was their obedience, their disobedience. That caused them not to be able to enter into the promised land. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 1. Therefore, since a promise remains of entering into his rest, and one of the things that we ought to remember every seventh day is that this day does picture entering into his rest when Messiah comes back. It is a picture of the 1,000 years when we get to rest from the interference of Hasatan and only have to fight our own human nature. But it is a picture of the rest that comes at the end of the 1,000 years, which we're going to end up with today in the book of Revelation. Therefore, since a promise remains of entering into his rest, because none of us have really entered into that ultimate rest, there are a few who have. They're resting if they've qualified. Book of Hebrews, this same book, chapter 11, tells of some of those people. But that's the only way any of us have entered into the rest, because we still have human nature, and we can still fall short. Let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it. For indeed, the Tov Basar, the good news, the gospel, was brought to us as well as to them. So for 40 years, Moses was telling those people they needed to return to Yahweh and obey Yahweh. For we who have believed do enter into rest, as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, should they enter into my rest? And of course, again, this is a repeat, and that's more of a question, should we enter into his rest? And it is by our actions that will determine whether we enter into that rest. By whether or not we follow the admonition by Yahshua, he that endures to the end. And Yahshua could have gone on and said, shall enter into my rest. And yet his works have come into being from the foundation of the world. And we're going to go all the way back to the beginning and see the establishment of this day from the foundation of the world. For somewhere he said this about the seventh day, and Elohim rested on the seventh day from all his works. And we're going to see that's in Genesis chapter 2. And in this again, if they shall enter into my rest, ... or should they enter into my rest? And of course, you can answer that in two ways. Should we? Yes. But will we be qualified to? ? Since then it remains for some to enter into it, and those who formerly received the good news, the gospel, the Tov Basar, did not enter into it because of disobedience. You see, not because they didn't believe, but they didn't believe in the Hebrew sense to obey it. He again defines a certain day, today, saying through David so much later as it has been today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Don't become, and this is why it's important to talk about the Sabbath on a regular basis, because, we can get to the point where we say, well, it's Friday again, and so tomorrow is the Sabbath, and we just endure the Sabbath. And that really isn't keeping the Sabbath as Yahweh intended it. Let us therefore do our utmost, he says. Well, he says, oh, wait a minute, I skipped ahead. If it says, don't harden your hearts, and if Joshua, this, the King James Version has Jesus here, but the real person that it's talking about is not Yeshua, it's talking about Yahshua, Joshua. if Yahshua had given them rest, by leading them into the promised land, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So, verse 9, why don't the Christians understand this? So there remains a Sabbath keeping for the people of Elohim. For the one, having entered into his rest, has also himself rested from his works, as Elohim rested from his. Let us therefore do our utmost to enter into that rest, the rest that Yahweh intends for the Sabbath, lest anyone fall after the same example of disobedience. For the word of Elohim is living and working, sharper than any two-edged sword, cutting even to the dividing of being and spirit, and of joints and marrow. See, it's not just a matter of heart, but it's what's in the inner being, and able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. Of all days, we ought to be cognizant of Yahweh judging the intentions of our hearts. There is no creature hidden from his sight, but all are naked and laid bare before the eyes of him with whom is our account. We all have an account. The book of Revelation talks about having your name written in a book. And our names are written in the book of life, and are we going to keep them there? That's an account. We have an account with Yahweh. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Yahshua, the Son of Elohim, let us hold fast our confession. And we need to do that on the Sabbath as well as every day. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who is tried in all respects as we are. It says apart from sin, and I think the King James says without sin, because in all respects he was tempted, but he never sinned. Therefore, let us come boldly to the throne of favor in order to receive compassion and find favor for timely help. So there's New Testament scripture all about the Sabbath, the necessity and the reality that there remains the keeping of the Sabbath for the people of Elohim. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, to that first Sabbath talked about in the scripture. In verse 31, after Elohim on the sixth day had created man, he says, and he said after every day it is tov, it's good, it's tov. Elohim saw all that he had made, and see it was tov ma'od. The only day on which he uses the term ma'od, which is the word for very or great, a magnitude of being tov, was on the sixth day. And the only difference between the creation on the sixth day and the other days is the sixth day he created man. And he said it was tov ma'od. We looked at this when we talked about did Yahweh make junk. And certainly when he says it's tov ma'od, Yahweh on the sixth day had not made any junk. And there came to be evening and there came to be morning the sixth day. In chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their array, and on the seventh day Elohim completed his work which he had done. How did he do that? By not making anything else on the seventh day. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And Elohim blessed the seventh day and set it apart, because on it he rested from all his work which Elohim in creating had made. So what do you think Yahweh did on that first Sabbath? Was all of his work complete? Was it complete? In verse 26 of chapter 1, he said, Yahweh created man in his image and after his likeness. Was that complete on the sixth day? No. So, in one sense, all of his work was not complete. What he had done on the sixth day that caused him to inspire the word ma'od to be added to the tov was the creation of man. And then he says, that Yahweh blessed the seventh day. Blessed in the Hebrew is in the Hebrew P-L. That's a tense, like we have perfect, we have present, we have future, we have past perfect. We've got all these tenses in English. Unless you took a lot of English classes, you probably aren't aware of that or have forgotten that from high school. But the Hebrew has tenses and it has senses of verbs. The word blessed is in the Hebrew PL on the Sabbath day. That means it's both declarative. We talked a little bit about declarative last night. There were some declarative statements, several in the 23rd chapter of Isaiah. And they were, someone, rightly said that, well, they're statements of like commands, declarative commands. PL is dual. It means that the word is declarative, like a command, but it is also causative. Causative. The difference between declarative and causative is one is a command, one is resulting. Because you do this, it results in that. So the blessing is causative. We think of the statement, remember the Sabbath day, as declarative, don't we? Pretty much. That Yahweh, that's a command of Yahweh. In fact, in Christianity, they recognize, even though they don't keep that day, that it is one of the commandments. It's the fourth commandment, right? Command. But this word blessed is also causative. Yahweh declared that the Sabbath was, he declared, declarative, that the Sabbath was kadosh, set apart. But he also declared that it was caused, that by properly keeping the Sabbath, you are caused to be kadosh. And by your keeping of the Sabbath, you cause the Sabbath to be set apart. We don't think of the Sabbath that way. We don't think of Sabbath keeping in that sense. But that is what the Hebrew sense of pial is here. It's declarative. Yahweh declares it, but it is causative. By properly keeping it, it becomes what he says, kadosh. It becomes kadosh. So the causative means that the Sabbath was a means for man to be kadosh. Yahshua said the Sabbath was not made for man, but the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath, that's how the Sabbath is made for man. It causes you to be kadosh. It causes you to be set apart. That four-letter word in the King James language, holy. So do you get that? What animal is there that can become kadosh or set apart by keeping the Sabbath? How could I go out there and talk to Rebecca and Virginia? How could I get across to them that there's something that's different about this day that they need to do? I could declare that to them, that would cause them to be kadosh. I'd be wasting my breath, wouldn't I? Or those chickens. Now, how can you tell those chickens they shouldn't lay an egg on the Sabbath? Now, if you could, then they could be kadosh, couldn't they? It doesn't work that way. There's no animal, your dogs, your cats, none of your animals can you get that across to them that they could actually be caused to be kadosh because they keep this declaration of the Sabbath. Not a single one. A kadosh day. What is different about the structure of this day? What makes this day kadosh? I mean, it's still got 60 minutes every hour, doesn't it? Still has 24 hours in the day, just like any other day. What is there about this day that makes it kadosh? Is it just because you recognize it? Is that what makes it kadosh? Let's look at some scriptures. Exodus chapter 16. Exodus 16 and verse 23. Moses was speaking here, and he said this to them. This is what Yahweh has said. Tomorrow is a rest. Now that's a declaration. A Sabbath set apart to Yahweh. That which you bake, bake, and that which you cook, cook. And lay up for yourselves all that is left over to keep it until morning. So, we look at that and we interpret that, and we're not going to cook a pot roast today. Now we might have one cooked that we did on the preparation day, and we might warm it up. But we're not going to go through the labor of cutting up the carrots and the potatoes and everything and putting it in the pot roast and just roasting that today. The time that is the minutes that pass today are for something else. They're not for doing that. Chapter 16 and go up to verse 9. Moses said to Aharon, say to the congregation of the children of Israel, come near. Come near. And that's an extremely important statement. Come near before Yahweh, for he has heard your grumblings. And it came to be, as Aaron spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness, and see, the esteem of Yahweh appeared in the cloud. Now, they only saw the cloud and fire at first. That's all they saw. They're carnal individuals, and Yahweh has to reveal this to them in stages. But there's a clue there. Come near. Come near. They only saw the cloud. The difference in this day is the presence of Yahweh. The presence of Yahweh. Exodus 20 and verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to set it apart. Now that all sounds declarative. Verse 11 of chapter 20, Exodus chapter 20. Verse 11, for in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore Yahweh blessed. And there it is. That's both declarative and causative. The seventh day, and set it apart. So it takes personal preparation, and there are boundaries. There are boundaries that are set. Why are the boundaries set? Because of the presence of Yahweh. Because of Yahweh's presence. That's what makes the Sabbath different than any other day. Yahweh's special presence on the Sabbath day. Chapter 19, Exodus chapter 19 and verse 10. They had already had this vision. They had already had this statement. Verse 10, Yahweh said to Moshe, go to the people, set them apart today and tomorrow, and they shall wash their garments. So here's the preparation. Wash their garments, and shall be prepared by the third day. For on the third day Yahweh shall come down on Mount Zion, his presence, before the eyes of all the people. And you shall make a border for the people all around. Why was this border being made? Because Yahweh was going to bring his presence. So, though this is talking about that first Shavuot, the principle here is that when the presence of Yahweh comes, there's a border that is set. You have to set a border. You have to make preparation, and you have to set a border. A border for all the people all around, saying, take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain or even touch the border of it. Whoever touches the border shall certainly be put to death. So we need to transfer this preparation and this border idea. We need to transfer it to the Sabbath because we need to realize that Yahweh is in this day more than he is any other day. He's always in every day. You know, he never goes away. But this day, he causes it to be set apart by his presence. He tells you to do your work every other day, but you do not do that work on this day because his presence is here. Exodus chapter 24 and verse 15. Moshe went up into the mountain, and a cloud covered the mountain. And the esteem of Yahweh dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. For 6 days it covered it. And on the seventh day he called to Moshe out of the midst of the cloud, and the appearance of the esteem of Yahweh was like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain before the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moshe went up into the midst of the cloud and went up into the mountain. And it came to be that Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Now there's something about that. It's not the 40 days and the 40 nights, but it's the presence of Yahweh that you have to see. And that Yahweh's presence is with us in a special way on the seventh day. And it's by recognizing and approaching the seventh day Sabbath with the presence of Yahweh that causes you to be set apart. Paul Wilbur, before we continue, Paul Wilbur wrote a song, and it's based on Scripture, and it just struck my heart. It's been several years since I listened to it, but I have the lyrics. I'd like to read the lyrics to you. I have to change the words. The reason we don't sing it is because this fella knows the names, but he's not convicted of the importance of the names, and so he is one of those people that mixes. But the idea that he has of the presence of Yahweh is outstanding. So he's got this song, in your presence. This is kind of a Sabbath song. This is a Sabbath attitude that we need to have about the presence of Yahweh. In your presence, that's where I am strong. In your presence, O Yahweh my El. I had to change the words there. In your presence, that's where I belong. And it's not true as true of any day other than the Sabbath. I mean, we belong in Yahweh's presence, and it would be nice for us to be there. But we get it's so good to be here in this special place, but the cares of the world pull us away. All of the things that happen in the world pull us away. But we've got to be careful that we don't let it happen today. In your presence, that's where I belong. Seeking your face, touching your favor in the cleft of the rock. In your presence, O Yahweh. This is kind of an attitude that we should have on the Sabbath day. I want to go where the rivers cannot overflow me, where my feet are on the rock. I want to hide where the blazing fire cannot burn me, in your presence, O Yah. And this day is where we can go to find that. I want to hide where the flood of evil cannot reach me. And we know that there's a flood of evil in the world, and it gets worse every day. And here's the day when we can escape it. I want to hide where the flood of evil cannot reach me. Where I'm covered by the blood, I want to be where the schemes of darkness cannot touch me. In your presence, O Yah. You are my firm foundation. And this is something we should tell Yahweh at least every Sabbath, probably every day. I trust in you all day long. I am your child and your servant, and you are my strength and my song. You're my song. Seeking your face, touching your favor in the cleft of the rock. In your presence, O Yah, in your presence. And the presence is magnified by this day. It's what makes this day more special than any other day. When Yahweh gave the Israelites manna, he gave it 6 days. But it was absent on the Sabbath. Deuteronomy 8:3. And he humbled you, says in Deuteronomy 8:3, and let you suffer hunger and fed you with manna which you did not know. Previously, it means, nor did your fathers know, to make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of Yahweh. Yahshua repeated this, didn't he? When he was tempted by Hasatan in Matthew chapter 4:4. When he was hungry, he had been up there without food. I don't know. I guess it was after the 40 days and 40 nights. And Satan said, "Well, here you know, if you're the son of Elohim, change these rocks into loaves of bread." And that's when Yahshua quoted that scripture in Matthew 4:4. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of Yahweh. Exodus chapter 31 and verse 13, one of Wayne's favorite scriptures here. Exodus 31, verse 13. You speak to the children of Israel, saying, my Sabbaths you are to, and here he doesn't just use to keep, he uses guard, the shomer. You shall guard, protect. How do you do that? By putting a border around it, by putting a hedge around it. My Sabbaths you are to guard by all means. And then he says this very important statement, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations to know that I, Yahweh, am setting you apart. More than the other 6 days of the week, this day causes you to stop. Have you finished your work? No. Had Yahweh really finished his work? No, but he stopped the work. You are to stop your work, and you are to climb up into the lap of Yahweh, seek his face, appreciate his presence, and guard this day in that way. Don't let anything interfere. To know so that you know, and you know that Yahweh is setting you apart. So back to creation. For 6 days Yahweh filled the earth. And that's really what it says. Bara is to fill. In the beginning, Yahweh, it says created, but the Hebrew word is bara, and it means to fill. Yahweh spent 6 days filling the creation. And on the seventh day, he didn't do any filling. He stopped filling. On the seventh day, Yahweh filled the day with his presence only. Only his presence. And we ought to think about Yahweh filling this day with his presence, and we ought to accept that. In Exodus chapter 40 and verse 33. Exodus chapter 40 and verse 33. He raised up the courtyard all around the dwelling place and the altar and the place, and placed the covering of the courtyard gate. And Moshe completed the work. And the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the esteem of Yahweh filled the dwelling place. And Moshe was not able to come into the tent of meeting, even Moshe, because the cloud dwelt on it, and the esteem of Yahweh filled the dwelling place. Yahweh fills this day. And when the cloud was taken up from above the dwelling place, the children of Israel went onward in all their journeyings. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of Yahweh was on the dwelling place by day, fire was on it by night, before all the eyes of the house of Israel in all their journeyings. The Sabbath is Yahweh's sanctuary in time. Yahweh is not particularly concerned with time, except that this 24-hour period is not taken up with our everyday living. This day is taken up by the presence of Yahweh. It is Yahweh's sanctuary in time. So if you think of 7 days in the week, the seventh day is the sanctuary of Yahweh. So that means we should be abstaining from production, from purchasing things. And that teaches us to be detached and independent from the things. All of what we do in our labors, all what we do in our shopping, it's all involved in things. But this day is not involved with things. Not involved with things. We're not dependent on those things on this day and attached to those things. Today, we are dependent on the Ruach. We're dependent on the presence of Yahweh. It stops us from seeking more. You know, that's what the 6 days of the week when we're doing all our labors, we're seeking more, aren't we? We're seeking to, pamper and take care of and get food for and get shelter for these physical bodies. But the seventh day, we have a vacation from that, if you will. It's not just frivolous rest, but it is solemn rest. And what makes it solemn is the presence of Yahweh. And it gives us a sense of belonging, not to the world, not to those physical things, but belonging to Yahweh. Exodus chapter 31 again in verse 13. We read this already, but think of this scripture in the sense of now we belong. We belong to Yahweh. You, verse 13, Exodus 31:13. You speak to the children of Israel, saying, my Sabbaths you are to guard by all means, for it is a sign. What does it mean? It's a sign. It's a sign of your belonging. It's a sign between me and you throughout your generations to know that I, Yahweh, am setting you apart. And it's the only sign. It's the only sign that Yahweh is setting us apart. It's the sign of the everlasting covenant. It's his Sabbath. Exodus 31 and verse 16. And the children of Israel shall guard the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as an everlasting covenant between me and the children of Israel. It is a sign forever. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heaven and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. This sign idea is repeated in Ezekiel twice. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 20, and we'll read the whole section from verse 12 all the way to the end of the chapter, verse 21. Yahweh said through the prophet Ezekiel, "And I also gave them my Sabbaths." Now, they're Yahweh's Sabbaths. You notice that they don't belong to the Israelites. And everything that Yahweh gave to the Israelites, he gave to them so that they could obey him, keep it, and be set apart by it, so that all of the other nations would see them and to say, what nation is there that's so great, that has their Yahweh for their Elohim? So they were to be an example, and they were to lead everybody, because salvation is not just for the Jews. I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between them and me, to know that I am Yahweh who sets them apart. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness, but Yahweh never gave up on them. And he says in Jeremiah that as long as the sun and the moon keep time, as long as there is existence of this physical earth, he would never cast aside the people that he had chosen. But they did not walk in my laws. They rejected my right rulings, which if a man does, he shall live by them. And they greatly profaned my Sabbaths. Now, isn't it funny that Christianity thinks that Yahweh replaced Israel because they disobeyed him, and they don't even have to obey him to replace them? Does that make any sense at all? It makes no sense. Verse 14, "But I acted for my name's sake, not to profane it before the Gentiles." Well, wait a minute. I skipped a verse here, didn't I? "But the house of Israel rebelled against me. They did not walk in my laws. They rejected my right rulings, which if a man does, he shall live by them. And they greatly profaned my Sabbaths. Then I said," this is verse 13, "I would pour out my wrath on them in the wilderness to consume them in the wilderness. But I acted for my name's sake, not to profane it before the Gentiles, before whose eyes I had brought them out." See, he did it so that the Gentiles would esteem Yahweh. "And I myself also lifted my hand in an oath to them in the wilderness, not to bring them into the land which I gave them, flowing with milk and honey, the splendor of all lands, because they rejected my right rulings and did not walk in my laws. They profaned my Sabbaths." So if Yahweh is going to punish them for profaning his Sabbaths, is he going to let the Gentiles not be profaned because they profane his Sabbaths? Of course not. "For their heart went after their idols." And are their hearts going after their idols? Yes. "And my eye pardoned them from destroying them. I did not make an end of them in the wilderness. And I said to their children in the wilderness, do not walk in the laws of your fathers, nor observe their rulings, nor defile yourself with their idols. I am Yahweh your Elohim. Walk in my laws, guard my right rulings, do them, and set apart my Sabbaths. And they shall be a sign between me and you, to know that I am Yahweh your Elohim." So what do the Gentiles have to do to have a sign that they are Yahweh's? They have to keep his Sabbaths. Just the same thing that Israel had to do. "But the children of Israel still rebelled against me. They did not walk in my laws and my right rulings. They did not guard to do them, which if a man does, he shall live by them. They profaned my Sabbaths, so I resolved to pour out my wrath on them to complete my displeasure against them in the wilderness." So he did it in the wilderness, and then he cast them into even a greater wilderness, the wilderness of this world. And he never let them inherit the whole of the promised land that he had promised to Abraham. Isaiah 58 and verse 13, which we're going to get to one of these days, as we slowly plod through the book of Isaiah in our weekly studies. Isaiah 58 and verse 13. If you do turn back your foot from the Sabbath. So in Isaiah, they were still profaning the Sabbath. And Isaiah prophesies that they're going to go into captivity, right? Just like it said back there in Deuteronomy 26, or Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. He promised them if they continued to break his laws, they would go into captivity. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your own pleasure. So, with the presence of Yahweh here, we have to watch out that we don't do our own pleasure. On my set-apart day, and shall call the Sabbath a delight, the set-apart day of Yahweh esteemed, and shall esteem it, not doing your own ways. So there are things that we do all week long that are our own ways that we should not be doing on the Sabbath. Nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. Now this is probably the area that we are most delinquent in, speaking our own words. I don't think that we pay enough attention to what words are coming out of our mouth in the presence of Yahweh that are different than the words that we speak the other 6 days of the week. Not speaking your own words. Then, now, is it all right for us to have some idle chit-chat with people on the Sabbath day that we haven't seen all week? How are we going to encourage one another if we don't? But it means that we have to limit the amount of that. That yes, we do it so that we can encourage one another, but we have to realize, hey, there comes a time when it's got to be cut off, and we got to get on with speaking the words of Yahweh. Not speaking your own words, not doing your own pleasures, then you shall delight yourself in Yahweh. Somehow we have to get Yahweh in the conversation. We have to be delighting in Yahweh. We do that when we're encouraging one another, but let's not spend the whole day encouraging one another. You know, let's talk about Yahweh and Yahweh's kingdom. He says, then I shall cause you to ride in the heights of the earth, feed you with the inheritance of Yahweh, Yaakov your father, for the mouth of Yahweh has spoken it. And so when he says he's going to cause us to do that, that's when we have come to the appreciation and the deep feeling about his presence on the Sabbath day and how he is setting us apart, on this day. Isaiah 56 in verse 6. Also the sons of the foreigner who join themselves to Yahweh, to serve him, and to love the name of Yahweh, to be his servants, all, were some of those Gentiles? The foreigner who joins himself to Yahweh, yeah. All who guard the Sabbath and do not profane it, and hold fast to my covenant. The covenant is not just for Israel. The covenant is for everybody. Now, granted, Paul rightly says that they have to be grafted in. They have to join themselves to the Yahweh, to the Elohim of Israel. Them I shall bring to my set-apart mountain, and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their slaughterings are accepted on my altar. For my house is called a house of prayer for all peoples. This is in Isaiah. Isaiah is a prophecy. Oh, yes, it was a prophecy that was partially fulfilled in the captivities of Israel and Judah. But it's for the end time. It's for when Yahshua returns. It jumps ahead to the end of the book of Revelation. It jumps ahead to the end of the book of Revelation. When Yahweh says he's going to accept their burnt offerings and their slaughterings on his altar? Yes. Verse 2 of Isaiah 56. Blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who lays hold on it, guarding the Sabbath Everybody who guards the Sabbath will be blessed. It's declarative and it is causative. And guarding his hand from doing any evil, lest he profane it. Guarding his hand from doing any evil. In verse 4, Isaiah 56. Thus said Yahweh to the eunuchs who guard my Sabbaths. Now, we're going to come to the place, or we have already passed the place. No, I think it's in Deuteronomy. We're going to come to the place in the Torah studies where it says a eunuch cannot come into the house of Yahweh. But we remember that because we've studied that every year for the past 10 or 15 years when we've been reading the Torah studies, right? But look at what this says, Isaiah. This is the Messianic kingdom to come. For thus says Yahweh to the eunuchs who guard my Sabbaths and have chosen what pleases me and hold fast to my covenant. So to them I shall give in my house and within my walls a place and a name better than that of sons and daughters. I give them an everlasting name that is not cut off. So, there's hope for everybody, but the greatest hope that anybody has is in coming to appreciate Yahweh's Sabbath and realizing that it is declarative and causative for everyone. So within the Sabbath is the very gospel, because it's for everybody. The Tov Basar. Yahweh has been seeking to dwell with man from creation. He's been seeking to dwell with man since Genesis 1:26. It's Yahweh's purpose for man, so that he will dwell with him. Yahweh has been seeking to dwell with man from creation. Creation of the sixth day followed immediately by the Sabbath, the Mishkan, or dwelling place, Yahweh's term, or Yeshua's term on earth, Yeshua's return, and finally, Revelation 21. Revelation 21, verse 1. So, all of this time, Yahweh sent Yeshua to tabernacle with man, but man was, too corrupt to receive him. He's going to send him again. And he's going to purify the earth with fire. Isaiah 21:1. And then I saw a renewed heaven and a renewed earth. For the former heaven and the former earth passed away, and the sea is no more. And I, Yachanan, saw the set-apart city, renewed Jerusalem, coming down out of the heaven from Elohim, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And that's figurative. That's just an analogy, an analogous thing. Get the big picture. Don't focus on this. How is he going to marry a city? Don't focus on that. Get the big picture. And I heard a loud voice from the heavens saying, "See, the booth, the sukkah of Elohim is with men, and he shall dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and Elohim himself shall be with them and be their Elohim." This is a picture, a final picture of what the Sabbath should mean to us. The Sabbath is in that verse, the presence of Yahweh with men. Chapter 22 and verse 12. Revelation 22 and verse 12. And see, I am coming speedily, and my reward is with me, to give to each according to his work. I am the Aleph and the Tau, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. Blessed are those doing his declaratives. And so by doing the declarative are having the causative come on them, so that the authority shall be theirs unto the tree of life, and to enter through the gates into the city where he dwells. The fulfillment of the Sabbath with the presence of Yahweh, and to be in the presence of Yahweh forever. That's where I belong, in your presence, O Yah. May Yahweh bless you and guard you. May Yahweh make his face shine upon you and give you his favor. May Yahweh lift up his countenance over you and give you his peace. Yivarekeka Yahweh vayishmereka. Ya'er Yahweh panavaleka vikaneka. Yasa Yahweh panavaleka v'yasem laka shalom. So whenever you think